Hey Hermits, welcome back to my channel. My name is Dara and today I'm going to be wrapping up all of the books that I have read in April. It's a beautiful spring day today, so I thought I would switch things up and film outside, but I will say that I do live in a city, so if you can hear any ambient noise, I'm sorry, but I just wanted to take advantage of this sunlight. So I don't feel like I had the best reading month in April. For one very big reason, I actually came down with COVID a few days into the month and I got hit really bad. Like, the symptoms were awful. I was down and out, unable to work for about 3 weeks, and for a good chunk of that I couldn't even read. I couldn't look at a screen, I couldn't look at physical pages of a book. It just wasn't happening for me, so that means that I just had a lot less time and energy to devote to reading. However, having said that, I still did manage to read 9 books, and that's nothing to sniff at. So I'm going to go through these in order of books read, just because that's what makes sense to me. The first book that I read in April was Fierce Fairy Tales and Other Stories to Stir Your Soul by Nikita Gill. Now, Nikita Gill is a poet that I have read before and loved. So she wrote Wild Embers, which is probably one of my favourite poetry collections. But when I saw this book, I actually thought it was going to be more short stories, so retellings of fairy tales, and it wasn't really that. It was there were some short stories in there, but it was also a lot of poetry, which I loved and was thrilled about. But what I will say is that it felt almost like it was 2 collections bound together, because a good chunk of them were fairy tale retellings, which is exactly what I was in the mood for, but then the other chunk of them were more related to the struggles of being a woman, things like mental health, body image, things like that. And while I still enjoyed those pieces, it just didn't feel like they belonged in this book, and so it did impact my level of enjoyment. But I will say, if judging purely by the fairy tale section, which is what I was reading it for, it was stellar. I particularly loved the retelling of Peter Pan, and Peter Pan is actually not a story that I usually enjoy. It's never been my favourite. I've watched films and I've read the book, and it's just it's fine, but it's never been top tier for me. But the retelling specifically of the origin story of Peter Pan and Hook's let's say animosity towards each other, that for me was a real highlight. I actually loved that interpretation. So highly recommend if you are looking for either an intro to poetry and you feel like a full book of poetry is too intense, or if you're just looking for some whimsical fairy tale retellings, it's a great place to start. The second book that I read in the month of April was The Culmination of Everything by Christina C. Jones. I believe this is the first book in a duology called the Sugar Valley series or something like that. But to be honest, I'm probably not going to read the second installment, and that's not to say that I disliked the first one. I didn't. It's one of those ones that feels like a complete book. It doesn't necessarily feel like it's necessary for me to pick that one up, at least not imminently, because I know it deals with different characters. It's just in the same location. So I originally picked this up so this was when I was just being able to physically read again. And this came off the recommendation of Brie from Love and Other Words, because I know she loves Christina C. Jones and the Sugar Valley series is one of her favourites. And I did enjoy it. It was an enjoyable read. There were some things that sort of irritated me a little bit, and I'm not sure if that's because I was feeling really under the weather and just generally irritable, or if it was sort of an element of the book itself. But there were just some moments where I was just but that would never happen. People would never do that. People would never say that. And I don't know if that's fair of me to say, because it's not like I know what all people would do or say. There were just elements of it that didn't feel entirely believable and didn't feel entirely organic. However, I did love the cast of characters. I did love that it had more depth to it than just being a romance. I like my romances to have a little bit more substance to them, to comment on issues greater than just love, as much as I love love, and I do. And so this one deals a lot with the topic of grief and how grief can show up in different ways, and not just grief like losing a loved one, but grief of losing a relationship, losing like your idea of the future. And it's tackled in a few different ways, which I thought was really smart and really interesting. So I think that everyone would be able to relate to at least one thread of the story in this book. All in all, like, it was, you know, it was fine, it was enjoyable, but it's not going to be like an all-time favorite. It's not going to be like top tier romance that's going to be sticking in my mind for the rest of my life. It's just not. But I would be interested in reading more books by this author because I did like her writing style, and yeah, I would give her another go. The next book I read in the month of April was The Unhoneymooners by Christina Lauren. This is my first Christina Lauren book, and I've actually owned it for quite a while. I've had it on my Kindle probably since I first started really watching a lot of booktube videos, which was, when would that be? I would say like last summer. So the end of May last year is when I really started watching a lot of booktube videos. And I remember, I want to say it was Noelle Gallagher where I heard this book talked about. So she was really like loving The Unhoneymooners and The Hating Game and some of the romances that came out, and Beach Read, some of the romances that came around that like same sort of time. And I picked it up on a Kindle Daily Deal. It was 99p, why not? But I would never felt particularly compelled to read it. But after being ill, like, my attention span was just not it, and I was looking for light, fluffy romances that were not going to be too much for my brain or too much for my nervous system. So I picked it up, I read it. It was fine. It was fine. Like, again, it was enjoyable for the moment. There were some major flaws in my opinion in terms of believability and emotion. Like, they weren't necessarily up there. And I don't know if this is predominantly a traditionally published romance issue for me these days, because I have started reading more like indie published romance on Kindle Unlimited. I sometimes feel like traditional romance has been kind of tempered down and anaesthetized and just made a little bit more bland, and unfortunately that felt like the case for The Unhoneymooners. I don't know, there was just nothing that grabbed me about it. There was nothing that gave me just like that feeling of like, oh my god, I need to know what happens, I need to stay with these characters. I just didn't have that draw, and so it was just a very average time for me. And I honestly don't think I'll be picking up any other books by this author, or these authors, sorry, because it's a writing duo. The next book that I read in the month of April was The Air He Breathes by Britney C. Cherry, and I think this was another recommendation from Brie. I must have watched one of her videos while I was sick, talking about, in fact I think I must have, because now that I'm thinking about it, the two books, The Culmination of Everything and The Air He Breathes, do have similarities, so they were probably in a video together. But anyway, The Air He Breathes was great. I actually had a really fun time reading it. Again, it touches on grief, and it does come at it from different perspectives again, which I like because it gives you a more well-rounded, more relatable perception of the topic, which I think is important. And it was like a small town, eccentric characters, two things I absolutely love in any books, but especially romances. We also had like a damaged couple, so they were an imperfect couple, which I enjoyed, because I think often we'll see one half of the couple have issues and have drama, and the other one be seemingly perfect, and it's kind of about fixing the broken one to create the relationship. And I don't like that. That doesn't feel real, and it doesn't feel fair. But when like both halves of the couple have their own like internal things to be dealing with, and they can still come together and support each other and be there for each other and grow together, like, that for me is something that I enjoy. I will say that there was a plot twist at the end that didn't feel entirely necessary. It felt kind of like I don't know, like in the last couple, like 100 or so pages, someone was like, oh, do you know what, like let's add a hint of a thriller to it, let's add some like crime and some drama and a villain. And I'm not sure that felt entirely necessary, and it didn't feel the most organic. It didn't feel like the book was building up to that. It was kind of like, we're having this like romance with these personal dramas and this personal evolution, and then suddenly bam, we've got a villain, which was strange, jarring, unnecessary. However, I still did really enjoy my time reading this book, so I'm gonna forgive that little like touch of bizarreness, and I will definitely be reading more books by this author because I liked her writing style, I liked her characterization, I liked, for the most part, the way she put her plot together. So yeah, it was a gold star from me. The next book that I read was Fix Her Up by Tessa Bailey. This is the first Tessa Bailey book that I've read, and I can tell you with 100% certainty that it will be the last. I thought this book was bad. I thought the characters were flat and unbelievable. I thought the relationships were flat and unbelievable. I felt like the plot was flat and unbelievable. And just generally, what is the deal? Like, I don't understand the hype. I've not stopped hearing about Tessa Bailey's books for, I don't even know, like a year. Am I reading something different to you guys? I just don't get it. I don't get it. And I've heard it said that she writes like the best smut that has ever been written, and that, judging by this book, she absolutely does not. I don't even know what to say. And one of my absolute pet peeves, okay, is when a character has, you know, like a drama to overcome, such as a difficulty with her family, or like some kind of trauma from her past, or like something along those lines, and the problem is just so like nothingy. I like, sometimes I'll read things and I'm like, you know, like people have real problems, people have real struggles, people have to go through some awful things in life, and this is what you're moaning about, this is what you're basing your character arc on. Have some depth. I don't even know if that makes sense, but there was just, so I'll give you some context, it's not really a spoiler. So the main character in Fix Her Up, I literally cannot remember her name, that's how not memorable this book is, but she has supposedly this really difficult relationship with her family, and the beginning and end of it is that they treat her like she's the youngest. Like, that's it. And like, by the way, she's the youngest, and they treat her like she's the youngest, and that is the great pain and bitterness that she's carrying through her life, that is impacting all of her choices, that is making her like sad and depressed and lonely and all of these things. And I'm just like, what? No, you can't build an entire character on the fact that her family treat her like she's young, when, by the way, she is young. She's like, I don't know, 21, 22, something like that. What? So you are young and your family treat you like you are young, and that is the greatest trauma of your life. Tessa, you can do better. The next book that I read in the month of April was Solo by Jill Mansell, and this was a reread for me, a very nostalgic reread. I picked this up at a charity shop. I don't think you'll have seen the book haul that features it by the time you see this video, but it's coming. And this is a book that I read many years ago, and I've read it a few times, but it was one that I just grabbed off, I can't remember if it was like my mum's bookshelves or maybe my nan's bookshelves, but I borrowed it from someone and devoured it. And I think it was probably one of the first adult romances that I'd ever read. And Like, the reread was pure nostalgia. If I was reading it for the first time now, it would not, you know, it would not be good here. It just wouldn't. It was written in 1991, which is the year I was born, and you can tell that it is somewhat dated. So like, there are things in it that, like, they wouldn't pass muster these days. Like some of maybe the comments about women's looks and bodies, like, it's not a big thing. Like, there were only maybe 1 or 2 comments in the whole book, but even so, like, you just wouldn't be able to say that kind of thing nowadays. But it was still a fun time for me. So if you've never heard of this book, which you probably haven't because it's not one that's talked about anywhere, it tells the story of a young woman called Tessa. She's an artist. She is pretty poor. Like, she lives in a tiny little cottage, doesn't even have a phone line. Like, she is barely making ends meet. But her friend, who works at this really fancy hotel, drags her to this big party there, and she ends up at this party. She's not really having a great time, so she goes and sits outside, and then this guy, who actually is one of the owners of the hotel, is trying to sort of escape from this woman who's got her eyes set on him, and he ends up going outside and bumping into her, and they just get talking, and they end up having this, like, one night stand, and that's supposed to be it, right? But then a few weeks later, Tessa realizes that she is pregnant, and it's sort of telling the story of how that relationship evolves. But not just that, also how a lot of the, I suppose, the cast at the hotel navigate their relationships too. So we have a few different characters come into play. So we have Tessa and Ross. We also have Tessa and one of her oldest friends, Dominic. We have Max, who is Ross's brother, who really doesn't like Tessa, and his infatuation with this French actress Francine. But then Holly, who is Tessa's best friend, is in love with Max. And then Adam, who just clicks with Holly, is completely in love with her. And then there's a waitress named Grace who has a crush on Ross, but then discovers a secret about her parents which distracts her from all of that. Then we have Mattie, who is Grace's mum, and her relationships with both Grace's father and a new love interest. And then we have this horrible woman called Antonia, who was previously having an affair with Ross and doesn't want to let him go, her relationship with her husband, and her husband's relationship with someone else. And it's like lots of parallel stories happening all at once, and that might sound like a lot, but it doesn't feel overwhelming when you actually read the book. All in all, it was a fun time. I read it over a couple of days. It really helped me get back in the reading mood, and it's exactly what I needed in the moment. Like I said, it's not going to be anybody's like best romance of all time, but it was really enjoyable for me. And I think a big piece of that was the story itself, but then another like sizable piece of that was just the nostalgia factor. And something that I never realized before, but the surprise baby was born 2 days before me. So the surprise baby was born on the 5th of June 1991, and I was born on the 7th of June 1991, and I just thought that was like a really weird coincidence. So more Gemini babies in the world, I approve. The next book that I read in the month of April was Marriage for One by Ella Mace. I'm not sure if it's Ella Mace or Ella Macy. This book was not good. This book was not good, and I so wanted to like it. Like, the first, I want to say 40-50% had a lot about it. So it tells the story of this couple who basically don't know each other, but they get married on the first page, and you don't really know why. And obviously that is like explained as you go into the book. And they have to like live this fake marriage in order to sort of fool her family and get something that she has worked for. And it's just, I don't know, like like I said, the first chunk of it I enjoyed because I liked the main two characters and their dynamic to start with. I liked them getting to know each other, I liked sort of the first sprinklings of the mystery, but then the more time went on, the more I was just entirely unimpressed. It got quite repetitive. It got quite like weird and toxic. There were some things that the characters did that I was just like, oh no, not cool. Some of the lies that went on, not okay. And then there was a piece where she got ill and he was taken care of that seemed to drag on forever and didn't seem entirely necessary. Like, I usually like that in a romance, when you see the caring side of someone. Like in Luke Off With Love, I loved that element of the story, but in this case it just seemed to drag on for a very long time and didn't seem to really have much purpose, because like after the first few pages of that, you're like, yeah, he's caring, he's got this like sweet side, but then as more pages and more pages and more pages pass, it's like, okay, what's the point of this? And then at the end, we've been building up to this massive reveal, this massive conflict, and like, she's going to be really pissed off, and she is. But then within like a page, he lies to her for their entire relationship. They fall for each other. She finds out the truth. She like storms out and is like, this is it, I hate you, blah blah blah. And then he turns up and says, okay, I'll give you a divorce. And she's just like, no. And she refuses to have a divorce, and like it just doesn't make sense. Like, with what he did and how angry she was, I don't think she would then be like, if she's a reasonable human being, I don't think she would then be so forgiving and so understanding and so willing to dive straight back into a relationship. It just didn't make sense to me at all. And there were some characters that were just too two-dimensional, and some storylines that just didn't fit. So all in all, I wouldn't recommend this book. I finished it. It was fine, but I did notice myself for the last like 30% really like skim reading and just trying to get to the end. And for me, that's always a sign that it's just not a keeper. And then the final book that I read in April was an absolute gem. So I finally read The Secret Lives of Church Ladies by Dasha, Philia, and I loved it. And I am not usually a short stories girl, but honestly, it was so good. It was so good. And before filming this, I was trying to like rack my brain and think, okay, I need to tell them what my favourite short story from the collection was. But honestly, I don't think I can pick. They were all like that great. So if you haven't heard about this book, and I'm sure you have because it's really starting to gain a lot of attention right now, but it is a collection of stories that feature different black women who from the outside look like sort of good church-going girls, but on the inside they have depth and problems and stories and fears and desires, and it really dives into those. And every single one of the stories has something entirely different to offer. There are so many themes explored, so many important topics like sexuality and privilege and monogamy and anxiety. It's just so good. Every single story is so compelling. The one that jumps out to mind that I really loved was How to Make Love to a Physicist. I thought that was just delicious. I also really enjoyed Dear Sister. I really enjoyed Peach Cobbler. I really enjoyed, I can't remember the name of that one, but it's one of the early ones where they hate the snow, basically. So it's about two women who really hate the snow. I also really enjoyed the one about the two friends meeting up for New Year's Eve. Again, I can't remember the name of that one. That one was like kind of bittersweet. Like, I enjoyed the story, but it made me sad also. Honestly, like, I cannot recommend this book highly enough. If anyone ever, like, for the rest of time asks me for short stories recommendation, I feel like I'm going to recommend this book because it was accessible, it was enjoyable, it was smart, it was very well written, it like made you feel feelings, the vibes were there. Like there were no complaints I have about this book. And I read the ebook version, but I enjoyed it so much that I'm gonna be purchasing the physical copy, and I only do that with very, very favorites. I would be genuinely surprised if this did not make it to my like top books of 2022. All in all, I had an okay reading month. So I read some things that I really enjoyed, I read some things that I didn't. I'm just proud of myself for continuing reading, because there were definitely chunks of time this month where I really wasn't feeling it, but I know that if I read, my mental health is better. It just is. So go me for sticking with it. If you've read any of these books that I've wrapped up this month, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Obviously keep it spoiler free. But without further ado, I'm going to love you and leave you, and I will see you in the next upload.